So, hello everyone. And over in Southern California, I have Mr. Rob Haynes. Please say hello, Rob.
Hello, Rob.
You got to do it, right? And the man of the hour is going to be Mr. Nick Ames, joining us from our facility in Phoenix, Arizona. Please say hello, Nick.
Hello, everyone.
There you go. See, he didn't take the bait, Rob. You took the bait. He didn't take the bait.
You know.
Okay, so today's session is going to be on transfer function. We're going to take kind of a deep dive into what transfer function is all about. I don't know, Raj, should we bother with the keynote or just kind of talk about some stuff first?
Whatever you guys want to do.
No, we'll skip the keynote. We'll just kind of talk about it. We hear the term transfer function a lot. I know, Matt and I were just talking. I'm old, I admit this. And back in the day when we were designing subwoofer enclosures, we would often talk about the transfer function of the car. And what we were talking about is the change that happens when we put a subwoofer into a vehicle, that the response is different. It's not quite the same as we might have predicted. Like a computer response, we would do computer modeling and we'd see a nice pretty line. And we'd always try to make it really flat down to the lowest frequency. And then smarter people would say, no, the transfer function of the car will help you. What they were talking about was to change from the reference or the predicted response to the actual acoustic response or the audio that you would hear. So the example I always like to give is like if you had like an 8-inch subwoofer and you put it in an anechoic chamber, it would have a certain response. That would be the reference, right? Yeah. But then if you took that 8-inch sub and you put it in a room, it would sound different than that. It would measure differently from that. And if you took that same sub and you put it now in a car, it would measure differently again. And the effect that the car had on that reference signal, the original predicted response, we would call the transfer function, what the vehicle did to that system, the change between where it started and where it is now. Well, that in a nutshell is what transfer function really is all about. We're going to talk about things today about like what you can learn from looking at a transfer function, because it's not just about subwoofers. There's a bunch of different things that we can do. You know what? Let's just jump right to Nick, I think, at this point. So, yes, you, Nick. I like the example of the sub in the car, but I want to make it more clear of what a transfer function is really all about. And I think what Nick has, he's got a vehicle behind him that he could do lots of different measurements. So here's a view of his screen, and he's going to kind of guide us through in Tune software what a transfer function looks like and what you need to have to make it all work. So I'm gonna stop talking just for a minute though and let Nick take it away.
Okay, so maybe where we should start from this point forward is how to set up a transfer function measurement in the software. So as Steve mentioned, there's kind of the terminology can have multiple meanings in a way. Depending on the context. So like the kind of old school concept as it relates to car audio of a transfer function is how the vehicle's interior affects a subwoofer, like how it changes the gain of the acoustic energy from the sub. But we also have these measurement engines in our software that are called transfer function engines, and they compute a transfer function with two inputs. So normally by default, you'll see TF3 set up just like this, and it's getting the stream from microphone 3 for the measure signal, and then the stream from the internal loopback, which is the noise that you're sending into the system. That's the reference signal. So in this case, everything in that measurement loop between the noise that you sent out to the system, if you imagined this reference signal represents the RCA outputs of Max, and it's sending a noise signal into your system. Maybe it's going into the aux input of the head unit, and then that signal from the head unit goes to the DSP amplifier, speaker wire speaker, through the air to the mic. All of those things in that loop are what this transfer function engine is measuring the transfer function of, basically. So
it's the difference between the way the signal started out to what it actually is now, where the microphone is.
Yes. Yep. Okay. Exactly.
So we're going to capture all of that, everything from the electronics to the reflections in the car, so to speak, and everything else that's happening. You're going to see all of that compared to that reference.
Yeah, how the signal changed as it passed through the system. The system being whatever is in that loop, whatever is in the measurement loop between these two signals, between the reference and the mic, right?
Perfect. Okay. So, and just for clarity, what Nick shared there pretty quickly was by default, when you get Tune 4 and connected to Max, the default setting is that we multiplex the 5 mics for the RTA reading. So you're actually getting a spatial average of the 5 mics. But the transfer function, where we're going to get our timing reference, is just the red mic, which we position in the center. The red mic becomes the measurement, and the reference is from the internal signal generator that's inside of Max in the software, so to speak. So it's going to capture everything from when the signal is started to be created until the point where it's captured by the microphone. And that is the default setting. If you change nothing, you're going to see exactly what Nick has right now.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And when making a transfer function measurement, the first thing that I always recommend that you do is, rather than just dive right into one of these like magnitude or phase or one of the types of data that the transfer function gives us, I would always recommend looking and making sure that that you actually have signals that you want to work with, right? So like if you don't have a reference signal and then you try to play a transfer function, maybe you thought the noise was started, or maybe it really was, but this reference was set to something else. Maybe, this was set like over to here or something like that. And then you push play on the transfer function. See, if I send noise through the system and I actually play a signal, now there's really a signal coming through the car, see? Because if I take a look here, I'm going to do us a quick favor and turn off multiplexing. And there's a reason, you'll see why in a minute. So we're just going to look at a single microphone, mic 3. See, on the RTA, you can see that there's some signal there. But our transfer function number 1, or whichever one I was trying to look at, sorry, I need to set that back up again. My bad. So, okay, so our measure signal comes from, so we'll look at TF1 here, right? Our measure signal comes from the mic, and our reference signal, if it was over here on something that has no signal, right? Then if I try to look at TF1, it's not computing anything. Now this data is left over from before. You can see it's not updating. Whenever the reference signal goes away, it stops updating. So as soon as I move this over to somewhere where there's signal.
Stay on that screen for a second, Nick.
See, now TF1 is live again. Do you see the coherence updating?
Nick, on that screen, I just want to point out a couple of things that just north of where your cursor is currently, there's a bunch of meters on the settings screen. The meters are showing that signal is present at those particular points. So you can see each of the microphones, and you see the internal loopback has signal showing up. The digital routing there shows nothing. The LNR, that shows nothing. There's no signal there. And then if you go to the right of that, the signal generator has signal. Yeah. So what Nick is referring to is, if you had a reference that had no signal, there is no transfer function, because there's nothing to start with. You need a beginning and an end. The beginning is your reference. The end is your measurement. So without a beginning or an end, you don't have a transfer function.
Yes, and see, and let me show you another. I guess we kind of have no choice but to jump ahead into some little tips and stuff. A second ago, when I moved, watch. Okay, so there's a transfer function, and it's updating in real time. Okay, and then when I move this signal over, it stays there, right? It didn't go away. And even when I hit the V key to refresh the averager, it stays there. And the reason that it stayed there is because that transfer function engine is still on. You see the little play button here? It's still playing. And you can see the little play button here. It's still on, but the reference signal went away. When the reference signal goes away, when it drops below a certain threshold, then the transfer function engine will stop calculating. It'll just freeze where it's at. And the reason it's like that is because you can use music as a test signal if you want to. It doesn't have to be pink noise for transfer function measurements. And if you were playing, a music track, or maybe a couple of tracks, or maybe like some kind of noise or music signal on repeat, like on a CD or a USB stick or something, if there's a pause or some break between the signal, rather than the measurement data just blowing up into total noise on the screen, whenever the reference signal drops away, it just stops computing. And then as soon as you bring the reference signal back, it'll begin updating again. So that's why this data froze on the screen like that when I moved the reference signal over, and when we lost reference signal.
Okay, hold on one sec, Nick.
Okay.
There's some cool stuff that some of our audience members may not be aware of. When you made the engine stop calculating because there was no data on the reference, you knew that it had stopped, but the audience may not have. So you had mentioned something about coherence. What is coherence, and how is that important?
Well, that's this information up here at the top, this red looking stuff, right up here. And that just shows data points that have a strong correlation to the reference signal versus data points which have energy at them, but it has no relationship to the signal that you sent out to the system. So I can tell that this isn't updating because I can tell most easily because that coherence data is just frozen. It's not moving, right?
Because I've noticed, Nick, that when we've done measurements, that the blue trace in this example on that top graph, that even when it's live data, it doesn't move around a whole lot. It's pretty stable.
Yeah, it's very stable. Yep.
So the pink data, that coherence data along the top, for me, is also a telltale sign of what's actually going on. Is it live or is it captured or frozen in this case? So I just want to spend just a moment clarifying that the coherence gives you an ability to see if there's noise coming from something outside of the electrical part of the measurement. What I mean is the reference, we know exactly what the reference is because it's being generated, so we can see that, and then we can actually capture data. And if there's a good correlation between the data that we're capturing versus where it started, you'll see a nice flat line on coherence across the top. If, however, there's some noise coming in from an outside source, like an air compressor or a truck going by on the highway, you'll see the coherence drop down at those points. So as you're tuning a system, you could ignore if there's a whole bunch of noise that's affecting your measurement. You don't put as much faith in what you're looking at in the magnitude response or the blue trace. If the spikes from the pink are coming down really deep, you can pretty much guarantee that signal is not part of your system. It's something outside of the system. And don't chase it because you're probably not going to fix it. You're not going to stop the air compressor by adjusting an EQ band, right?
Yeah.
Can we compare that to the RTA so we can see the difference in the noise?
Sure. Yeah. Here, I'll get this measurement engine running again by feeding it a reference signal, and then let's see here. So I'm coming in off of mic 3. So so mic 3 on the bottom, mic 3 on the top.
Hey,
so
can you do me a favor while you're there?
Mm-hmm.
Is the car close enough that you can like tap on the window or something?
Yeah.
So you'll see the noise show up. You see that?
All right, I think
That's cool.
Steve might have froze.
We froze?
Oh,
yeah, it looks like we froze.
Oh, I still hear you
I'm back.
in real time.
We're moving again. So hopefully everyone got to see when Nick rapped on the window, the pink stuff got crazy and the blue kind of disappeared a little bit, and you could tell that things weren't right. And as soon as the noise went away, everything came right back. Great way of looking at a noise thing, which is a benefit of doing a transfer function for magnitude response. One of many. So.
Yep. Yeah. And here's one of the things Matt was kind of asking about. So I've set these to have a roughly equivalent scale size, the RTA version of this data versus the transfer function version of this data, right? And you can see in the transfer function, so there's a crossover on this speaker here, high passed at 450 hertz and also low passed at 6.3K. But anyway, you can see where there is a lot of noise, especially at low frequencies here. That data is hidden, right? And has to do with the blanking selection that we have here. The default is 85, but if I were to turn this all the way down to 0, then it'll plot all of the data just like it does in the RTA. I think our default value is 85, and then it goes as high as 99. We used to let it go all the way to 100, which blanks absolutely everything. But then that was another point of confusion where if the coherence blanking was all the way at 100, then everything would be blanked out and you wouldn't see anything. So,
and you think something was broken, so we decided to not do that.
99 is as high as we let it go. But when it's jacked way up like that, that just means now that any magnitude or phase data point which has an associated coherence value that is less than 99%, it will be hidden from the graph.
So the way I think of that is if there's a lot of noise, you can hide the noise by changing the coherence blanking. And if there's a lot of noise, it just won't even show up. So it doesn't clutter your response. You just see what's real.
Yep.
So in a loud shop, you can
Yeah,
still work on
you
this
could
without a
you
problem.
could still tune pretty effectively. Obviously, if there's some critical stuff in that area and the noise is at the same spot, you'd want to try to kill that noise at some point.
Yep.
But you could still work through it and kind of understand, okay, I know why that noise is there. On an RTA, you wouldn't have that benefit. You just see it show up on the response, and you'd probably try to fix it.
Yep. On the RTA, you can kind of, it's a little, maybe just a tiny bit trickier to see what's uncorrelated noise versus what is stable data. But you can kind of tell, like down here, this stuff's bouncing around.
Yeah.
But now keep in mind, this is a single mic measurement.
Right on.
The RTA. Another thing about the coherence data, while we're talking about it, is you can change the way it appears on the screen. Well, first of all, there's a hotkey, which that list is found in preferences, show shortcuts. Okay, so if anybody wants to know where those hotkeys are at, that's where they're at.
And you can print them, by the way.
And you can print them, but the hotkey is just the letter C for coherence. If you hit the letter C on your keyboard, it'll show and hide it. Okay. You can also right-click up here where it says coherence blanking. Notice if you move your cursor over it, it kind of highlights those words. If you right-click, you get a menu for 15%, which is, it just covers only 15% of the graph area, or 25% of the graph area, or completely off, which the C key will also toggle it on and off.
Perfect. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a little bit about how the coherence data can be helpful with the transfer function measurement. So let me show you the issue that I've had many times, and I'm sure a lot of other people have, is if there is no reference signal and you start the transfer function engine, then you will see nothing. And you will wonder, why is there nothing? I can't see it. There's no data at all. And at this point, what I recommend you do before you even get to this point is look at the meters and gain tab. Okay. And then like down here, if you open up one of your transfer function graphs, notice on the meters and gain tab now, so I've chosen to plot magnitude down here, which is the same thing that we had plotted up on top a second ago. Okay, and I've chosen to play TF1. But now I've got nothing because there's no reference. We know that. But if you look up here at the meters and gain, you'll see there's a little R right here, and there's a little M on top of this meter, right? So that's just a little tip for the user that says, hey, this transfer function data that you have chosen down here in this graph, the measure signal for that data is this channel here, and the reference signal is this channel here. So at just a glance, you can look at your little R and see there's no signal there. So, there's something wrong. You have to have signal in order for any data to be computed. So that's just a little tip to help users. And even if you had phase down here on the bottom, it's still a type of transfer function data. So the M and the R will show up, showing you which is the measure and which one's the reference. So
Excellent.
as soon as I move this back over to a real reference signal, all of a sudden we have data there, and all of a sudden you see we have signal here. Another thing that I always recommend you do is take a look at the RTA of those two things. So reference, in this case, it's the analog reference, which is right down here, and the mic signal, which is right, the red one right here. So you can always just look at the RTA, the single spectrum view of the energy of the two signals that you're trying to compute the transfer function from. So if you ever try to, plot some kind of transfer function, magnitude or phase or impulse response, and you don't get anything, there's a reason why. Take a look at the two contributing signals. Look at them in the meters, look at them in the RTA, see what they are. And then that'll lead you to what's going on, and you'll quickly find the issue if that ever happens.
That's awesome, Nick. That bottom graph with the RTA, I like what you've done there. You're showing what the microphone is reading in a manner that many of us are probably familiar with looking at it on an RTA. But you also showed in the drop down on the upper right that you can look at what's going on the reference signal as well. And if we follow that blue data arrow down to the bottom or the lower part of that RTA screen, if you click that, and you can see that the reference is a straight line across that point of the graph. Yep. So what we're looking at is a difference between a straight line and what's being captured on the microphone, and that's exactly what a transfer function is. But the distinction between the RTA, one distinction between the RTA and what would be shown as a rough equivalent in magnitude on a transfer function, is the ability to look at coherence and see relative changes from one to the next, not just the SPL level, which is essentially what an RTA is, right?
Yes. Yeah. The RTA just shows absolute level per hertz, and the transfer function magnitude shows the difference between the reference signal and the measure signal as a function of dB, right? So, and that dB function comes from the dBFS. So these smaller letters, smaller characters here, these are the two levels that'll be referenced basically to determine where on the graph is the transfer function data going to be plotted. Okay.
Right on.
Notice how this is not plotted about the 0 dB point. Like if we were to kind of just eyeball the midpoint of this, it's somewhere around -27 or so. That's because our measure signal is roughly 27 dB or so less than the reference signal. If I were to take steps to gain this up so that it read the same dBFS -20 as the reference signal reads, then this data would be plotted around the 0 dB point, which is right up here, right?
So that makes sense in the context of what a transfer function is. We can see the difference in level between the reference and the measure, and it's shown on where it is positioned on the graph.
Yep, exactly. See, I gained this up. So now when I look at the small, don't look at the dBSPL part for this. The dBSPL part is not affected by gain because we know how much gain we're applying. So our dBSPL remains, an accurate reading regardless of how much gain you've chosen to apply to that mic signal, which is a big difference between Macs and an off-the-shelf interface. If you calibrate a dBSPL reading on an off-the-shelf interface, then as soon as you change that gain value on the interface, the reading's off. But anyway, so if I look at these small little values here that says -25 dBFS, if I look at that and I look at this one, which is -20, so they're in roughly the same area now. You see now we're closer to 0 right here.
Right on. Excellent.
Yeah.
And any deviations between that flat line and the acoustic response, that's something that's happening, like the speakers or the amplifier or the acoustics of the vehicle, something is affecting from where it was flat. The level, obviously the gaining does a lot of that, but the actual frequency response is deviation from flat caused by something between where we started and where we are now.
Yep.
Got it. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So let's see, what else could we talk about? I do have an example. I'm not sure, how are we doing on time?
Okay, we kind of went a little bit off, but I think we're okay. What are you going to show us?
Well, I do have an example set up of a different way of using the transfer function measurement to show the kind of traditional concept of a transfer function as far as a car's interior.
Yeah, show us. What do you got?
Okay, so another thing you can do with the transfer function system, it's very flexible, right? You can do a lot of stuff with it. It doesn't have to be the kind of traditional way that you think about it, where it's a reference signal compared to a mic. A transfer function measurement could be a mic compared to a mic. That can also work. So what I've done is I've placed one microphone, microphone number 1. I placed that right at the subwoofer cone. So there's a subwoofer in the back of this little mini. It's in a small sealed box. And I put a microphone very close to the cone. We'll use that microphone as the reference signal. And then for our measure signal right here, we'll use the center mic in the array, which is in the listening position. And we'll do a transfer function between those two mics. So this will show us how the subwoofer energy changed from its origin at the subwoofer cone to the listening position in the seat. So if we unmute our subwoofer and take a look. So let's start with the RTA.
Now, before we had this, Nick, you would typically do this by taking the sub out of the car and measuring it, right? And then putting it back in the car and taking a different measurement.
That's one that is one way that you could do it, and then use some kind of software to compute like a difference between the two.
or look at two different ones on an RTA, right? Two different traces.
Right. Yep. So here's those two measurements on the RTA. I'm going to get the EQ controls off there. We don't need those right now. So the subwoofer is the blue line. The near field mic at the subwoofer cone is the blue line, and the listening seat microphone is the red line. And this transfer function magnitude up here is the difference between those two. Now, I'll scan over a little bit so we can see a little lower in frequency. So one of the tricks that you can kind of do here is if I adjust the broadband level of both of these metered readings so that they're about equivalent again, kind of like we talked about a minute ago. So that meter and that meter are kind of close enough.
You'll notice as he does that, the one that's more prominent on the screen is what he's referring to.
Right. Yeah. Mic 3, the one at the middle of the array, which again, if we look at our transfer function setup here, mic 3 is the one that's our measure signal. We're talking about TF1. Just ignore all these other. We're talking about TF1. Mic 3 is the measure signal, and mic 1, which is placed at the subwoofer cone, that's the reference signal. So what I'm going to do is adjust mic 1 and mic 3. Those are the two that I'm looking at up here, and these are the two down here on the RTA. So I'm going to adjust those so they're roughly equivalent. That one maybe down just a little. Okay, and then we'll look at the transfer function between those two. And here
That's awesome.
So here's 0 dB right here. So with those two levels approximately equivalent, this is the gain of the subwoofer in the car as a function of the vehicle's cabin, right? So if this is 0 dB right here, you can see that at let's see, what would this be? At 20.2 hertz, there's a delta of 18.7 dB.
All right, hold on right there. There's so much cool stuff. I love it. So earlier we started talking about my example of like an 8-inch sub and a coic, or like in a gigantic room compared to that same 8-inch sub in a vehicle. So what you're doing is actually showing the effect of the vehicle by putting a mic right by the sub and seeing what it started out as, like at the sub versus at the listening position, and you're showing that cabin gain, that rise that took place between from where the sub was to where the sound is.
Yes.
And this matches, we were talking, so Matt wanted me to show everybody this. It's going to be hard to do, but back in, what was the year on this? 1996, we were doing training on transfer function where we would show graphs like this. And the three different ones that you're looking at, one's a large vehicle, the lower one. The middle one's a mid-sized vehicle, and then the highest one is a small vehicle. So the Mini would be between those upper two. And if you look at the data on that, it's actually matching pretty darn close to what Nick is showing. We're talking about this part here, just that part. That is the transfer function that we were talking about back in 1996. And now we can actually measure it. And if you look at that rise, that change in energy, that's what makes that 8-inch sub work in a car, and maybe not so much in a gigantic room.
Yep.
That's really awesome. Now, the other thing that I wanted to point out is Nick was using some tools that aren't obvious, like the cursor tool. What he did was he put a cursor at the starting point, and those controls are up in the upper right-hand section of the screen, that area where his mouse is now. You could set a cursor as a lock position, and the data for that will show up in the graph there, and at the window, right? So he's going to set a cursor there, and that data will stay fixed. And then you could move the other cursor, the free cursor, and you could see the change from wherever that cursor was originally to wherever the current one is. And when he said the delta, it's already calculated. You don't have to actually start looking at the little numbers. It'll actually show it to you in that screen. And you can even lock a second cursor to keep that position static so it doesn't constantly change on you. So you can look at it and analyze it.
So if you were to set cursor B at that peak of the response, what's the overall energy that you've gained from the car?
20.22.
So free 20 dB worth of output at about 20 hertz. That's pretty nice. I'll take that any day of the week, right?
Yeah. And that's, I mean, according to our very coarse approximation of gaining those two mics so they're roughly equal.
That's a cool thing. Obviously, it's an edge case, and we're not expecting a lot of people to do that. But I think that makes a nice connection between what a transfer function is. It's the difference between one to the next, the beginning of the signal to where it is now. So that's a good example of that.
Yeah. Something else that might be kind of interesting is I'm not exactly sure how well this is going to work, but let's just try it. So I captured the data up here, the transfer function data. I made a capture of it. So there's the
And
capture.
you did that by hitting the space bar.
Yep, I just press the space bar, or you can press this button here, this capture
Right
button. What I'm going to do is, now this car, you guys should know, I have no prior experience with this particular car. In fact,
Got a new car every week.
right up to the last minute, I was hooking stuff up. I'm going to tune this car when this is over.
Yeah.
So what I did real quick here was I just linked the L and R EQs, which go out to the sub amp. I linked them. So that way from this graph, we can control them both at once. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually EQ this sub. I'm going to just apply an EQ filter. Now,
Okay.
if the transfer function is measuring the reference at the woofer and comparing that to the mic in the listening seat, right? Then me applying EQ should change the RTA, but it should not really change this graph up here because both measurements will be affected equally. Therefore, the change of the EQ will be canceled from the data.
Right, because you're showing the difference between what came out of the sub, which
Yeah.
is affected by the EQ,
Yeah.
compared to what's being captured by the microphone, which is coming from the sub originally.
Right. That's what I'm thinking. That's what I'm hoping. Let's see. I don't know.
Let's hope so. Live demo, folks. Here we go.
So we'll put a EQ filter here. Yeah, it's not really changing.
Nope.
It changed down here quite a lot. Watch, I'll bypass that EQ real quick. All off. You see how much it changes in the RTA?
So the bottom graph showing RTA is changing, but the transfer function between where the sub started, where the microphone is not changing at all. It's
Not changing at all. And it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. If what we're truly measuring is just the difference between the sub at the where it started and the listening position, then this measurement up here really shouldn't change much at all. Maybe
because both are changing it the same exact way.
Yeah, they're both changing in the same way. Right.
Perfect. Okay, that makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's a big difference, between the transfer function data and the RTA data. The RTA data is absolute. The transfer function data is relative.
Relative, right? Got it. So now, if it's relative, a wise man once said that time is relative, right? So if we have a relative measurement, does that mean we can actually see the time domain?
Well, with transfer function measurements, yes, you can. So we could look at phase. This would be very weird. I don't have any idea.
No, not with this. This is just kind of showing an example that maybe we're comfortable with. But if we go back to the default settings that we would normally use, using a transfer function, the difference between the reference, which would be the beginning signal, in this case, the internal loopback, right? Or maybe the RCA out, whatever. And then one of the microphones in the array, the red one, the middle one, we'd be able to see the difference in, we saw that we can see the difference in level. We can see a difference in frequencies, right? So if we have a relative start, we can then see the difference in time, I would think, right?
Correct. Yeah. So I've set this up. What I did was I just hit return to defaults.
That's a beautiful button, everybody. Pay really good attention to that one. If you're having a problem, click that. It solves almost all your problems.
Take you back to default settings.
Even the engineer uses it. Figure that
all the time. So again, we'll use TF1 just to keep things consistent with what we've been doing. And we'll choose the red mic as TF1. Normally the red mic is TF3, but we're going to kind of cheat here and just stick with TF1 because that's what we've been doing. So we're going to put the red mic on TF1 and we're going to put the reference back on our generated signal. So this is, again, more like a tradition.
If you could go back to that screen for a second, there was a question that came up in the chat, Rob. If you could pull that up by Taylor. Taylor was wondering how we're getting the analog reference signal. And Matt, you wanted to show this, didn't you?
Sure.
Oh,
Okay, so what we use is what's called an internal loopback. So the loopback is essentially like a piece of wire that goes from the output of the generator to the input of the transfer function engine, right? So go ahead, Matt, take it away.
So on Max itself, right, when we're talking about the reference input, which is right here on the side, when you look at the settings in Tune, it said internal loopback, right? So what that is take an RCA cable, plug it into the reference input, take the other end, plug it into the output of the RCA.
It's effectively the same thing as doing that, but you don't need the wire. The internal reference is doing this part internally, internal reference. You could use an external reference and do exactly what Matt's showing here, but we've kind of made it a little easier. You don't even need the wire. Just click internal reference, and that's your reference. So basically, it's the exact output of the signal generator before it even goes anywhere. That you're going to capture everything from the time the signal started, its life in general, to the point that it's captured by the microphone.
Can you show how to change that from internal to external, Nick?
Yes. So this little, well, first of all, let's start from here. In measure settings, the measurement setup tab, this little picture looks like the end panel of Macs where the mic's plugged in.
Side of the box.
Yep. And that RCA connector that I think Matt showed, that would be right here. But as you see right now, the little picture of the RCA connector isn't there. It says internal loopback. If you click on this, you can see it turn my cursor as a hand. When I hover, it turns into a hand. When I click on that, it opens up this little dialog, analog reference source, internal or external. If I choose external and click OK, now you can see it says line level in. Now you got your little RCA connector. Now it's going to accept signals from the outside world. And you can see my meter now. I lost signal because
there is nothing.
A relay inside has switched states, and signal routing is no longer coming from the DAC output. It's now coming from this RCA jack, waiting for you to stick a signal into it. So what we did is we set it up so that you can just set it to internal loopback, and there you go.
There you go.
A loopback signal.
Hopefully that answers your question, Taylor. Sorry, carry on.
That was a really good question, actually. Okay, so time, I guess we were talking about, which we kind of talked about last week a little bit, but we didn't really go into how we got there. We just talked about the data once it was already being plotted.
Right.
So how we got there is this stuff, transfer function stuff. So the near field mic is still on. It's still on the woofer, and that's mic number 1. So let's see here. Sorry, I'm just bouncing around here. Okay, TF1. So there's the transfer function of mic number 1. Or wait, no, mic number 3. Sorry, that's the one in the listening position. This is the one at the woofer cone. So let's see here. What would be a good way to do this? Oh, I know one thing we could do with time. So let's do 2 transfer functions. We'll do one at the woofer cone, one at the listening position. So we'll do TF1 and TF2. TF1 is at the woofer cone, and TF2 is at the listening position.
Can you make that graph bigger, Nick?
Yeah, so those two. So let me hide this right here, and I can make that bigger. So this is basically just like the RTAs that we were looking at a second ago when we were looking at the difference between the mic at the cone and the mic in the listening position. We have the RTAs on the bottom graph showing those. This is basically just the magnitude representation of those same 2 signals. But what's cool about transfer function is we can look at much more than just level over frequency. So now another thing that we could do is we could look at impulse response. And there's TF2 and here's TF1. TF1's bigger because that signal's louder.
It's right by the woofer.
Yeah, so I'll scale that down, and I'm going to capture this actually.
So while you're capturing it, I want to kind of point out the way I understand this, that as you go from the left side of the graph towards the middle where the kind of squiggle is, that is time passing as you go from left to right, and there's no signal, and then suddenly there's an impulse, a rise in signal, and it could be either going upward or downward. It doesn't matter. It's a deviation from where there was nothing before, and now suddenly there's something. Then there's going to be some, I call it ringing effect, and that maybe isn't the right term, but you can see it goes up and down quite a bit, and then it starts to taper off. That is capturing the real-time signal as it's hitting the diaphragm of the microphone, basically. You're kind of watching what the microphone is doing.
Yep, exactly. And so that's exactly right. This is all noise floor, and then this is the signal when it encounters the mic as soon as it deviates from this noise, this kind of average noise level that you see.
And the reason why that's important is if you don't know when the signal actually starts, like the actual reference starts, you have no idea if it's noise or not. You have no visibility. So this allows you to see, look, the signal started, but so far I haven't captured anything yet. And at the 0 point, which if there's no reference delay set, right, and there's not, right? Right. So at the middle of the screen, the 0 itself, that is when it should start. Anything that happens after that is arriving later than when the signal started.
Right. It's arriving later than the reference.
Exactly.
Yep.
So when, just as a side note, while Nick gets ready to continue on, as a side note, when we go through and we're tuning an audio system, we are setting a new reference point by finding the latest arriving signal. So we shift everything to the latest arriving signal so that we could then delay everything to line up with it. Time delay, time alignment is essentially is what we're doing at that point, aligning everything to the same point in time.
Yes. Okay, so I captured this because what I want to do is look at TF3, the one in the listening position, this one, and it's smaller because it's lower in level. And I could gain the mic signal up to make that a little bigger. In fact, let's just do that. Let's go to mic 3 and we'll gain that dude up.
As a point of reference for what he's doing there, the impulse response is showing you a lot of data. It's not just when the signal starts. You can see the level of the signal by how tall it is. And if you get used to looking at them, you can also tell the frequency of that signal or the general frequency range. When you get good at it, you can determine if it's a tweeter or if it's a mid-bass or a subwoofer just by looking at the general shape of it. But there's a lot of information. You could also tell time by it, by how spread out it is. Well, but anyway, sorry, Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, so what I wanted to show here is that if I zoom in on these, hopefully these are visible to you guys.
It's better now that you zoomed in, but yeah.
Okay, so they're the reference delay for both. We'll have to talk about what reference delay is here in a second. The reference delay for both of those transfer function engines is both the same value. It's 0 in this case, but it's the same value, which means that you can see here that the microphone picking up signal in the listening position, that signal is showing up later in time than the signal at the woofer's cone.
Totally makes sense. It's further away.
Yeah. The orange one is right at the subwoofer's cone. The red one is that same energy after it arrived at the listening position. And the difference between those, if I were to use my cursors again, is 4.24 milliseconds. That's how long it took that signal to go through the air, basically. That's exactly cool. True. That is exactly correct. There's unaccounted for latencies or anything because these two measurements are identical. It's a mic and a mic, and they're compared to the same reference. So right any difference that we see in this time is a real difference of time of flight through air.
That's cool. That's really neat.
Yeah.
So you can tell time.
And the only other difference there is the transfer function of the vehicle that's happening, right?
And so that's why this shape
and then the gain difference in the mics, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. So okay, let's see here. Reference delay. Maybe it's a good time to talk about that. What reference delay is if we look at this, let's look at our settings. There we go. Look at our settings again, and we'll concentrate again on TF1. And remember, this reference signal right here is coming from the internal loopback, which is the DAC. So it's the exact same signal that's at the RCA output. It's that one. And it's looped back internally into the same exact ADC, just channel 8 of the ADC, the same ADC that's receiving signals from these mics. So the output latency and the input latency of the DAC and the ADC is equivalent on the reference signal as it is on the mic signal and the RCA jack. So I'm feeding this system with signals from the RCA jacks. So those two things are equivalent. The reference signal has the same inherent latencies as the signal leaving max and the signal coming in from the mic. So it's only everything else in between when the signal left max and when it showed up at the mic. It's those things that add additional delay to the signal at the mic compared to the loopback. So because the signal from the RCA jack had to go into the amplifiers through the DSP, there's latency there, to the speaker, then go through air, then arrive at the mic. All that extra delay time means that when these two signals are being compared in the transfer function engine, the reference signal will be later in time. The measure signal will be later in time than the reference signal. So in order for us to look at time-related things like especially phase, we need to account for that delay. We need to remove that extra delay that's in the measure signal.
All right. So what you're saying, if I understand right, is you want to get rid of the stuff that's not really a part of the system. It's part of the difference between reference and measure, but to make relative comparisons between different speakers in a car, for example, you'd want to find a more common place. So the number of in this case, where the signal is first starting after the zero to the right of the zero, whatever the number is at that point, it really doesn't matter. It's because we're gonna set a new reference point, not that one, right? Something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So if I'm going to take this orange one off of here, and I'm going to make it dual graph mode, and so we'll look at phase down here on the bottom. So if I wanted to look at the phase response of that sub, let's say, and let's just say that I wasn't really talking about tuning systems. Not yet. I just really want to know what is the phase response of the subwoofer. Well, this response that I have here is too steeply angled downward, right? So this phase response right here is showing me the phase response of the subwoofer plus all of the latency in the DSP and the time of flight through air to the listening position. So it's showing me all of that. So for me to remove those additional latencies and delays and just look at just the sub, I would need to set my reference delay so that time zero was somewhere over here near the beginning.
The beginning of when the sound hit the mic.
Yeah, the beginning of when the sound hit the mic. And that's about 7 milliseconds, 7.07. So if I could tell that by moving my cursor right over here to the beginning and looking at that, right?
So it shows the value in the upper window.
Yeah, this right up in here. See that? Where it says difference?
Yeah, they probably can't see the values, but when you're using the software, you'll be able to see those values and you could type them in. Now, here's something interesting, and I'm sure Nick is going to touch on it. Let me just jump ahead just for a moment, Nick. We have a routine called Find Delay that you can click and have it attempt to find the beginning of your impulse response. And we think it's very effective, and we hope that you might play with it one day and take a look at it. But by showing you how to look at the actual data, you can determine if it's right or wrong, and you can do it completely on your own. That's the good thing about automations, is that they can try to make your life easier. But if you know what they're doing, you can determine if they actually worked. So,
yeah, and I'm also showing you how to find the delay time of a subwoofer. And there will be a little bit more to this in just a second, which is one of the more challenging things that you'll try to find the delay time of compared to like a tweeter or a full range, some kind of full range speaker that has a lot of high frequency content, because this long, slow rise right here, the actual beginning of this is kind of not easy to discern.
Which is, I think, why a lot of people don't use impulse response to do this time stuff.
Yeah, it's why some people have gotten under the impression that it just can't work, but I'll show you here. It works. Perfect. So we'll hit enter. Okay, so this phase response is more close to the actual phase response of that sub. So I'll go back to how it was and just capture this, hit the space bar and capture it. And then we'll put that 7.07 back in. So you can see the difference between the red and where we started. Where we are now is more indicative of just the phase response of the sub itself without those additional latencies in there. And if you really want to get down to try to figure out what the start time of that impulse response is, what you can do is use our target generator, and you can here. Let me just reset these targets so that I have a nice flat line that I can use. Okay, so you can use our target generator, and you can create a low pass filter that models that subwoofer response. And when you do that, you will also create an impulse response, and you'll create an impulse response that tells you what that shape ought to be. Okay, so
just for clarity, as Nick goes through, what he's doing is he's trying to make a target that matches very closely to what the measured response of the subwoofer is doing. And by doing that, he'll find out what a nice clean impulse response would look like if it was that, right? If it matched it exactly.
Yes, exactly. So this yellow one right here is the one we captured before. And the red one, in fact, hang on, sorry guys. I'm just going to change the color of this tweeter. Or tweeter. It's that name right there. This is sub now. Okay. I'm going to change the color of this so that we can see it compared to the measured data. So, okay. So now when I play TF3 again, so that's where I moved my impulse response to. And this is where a modeled, just a very coarse, you can see all I did was apply a 36 dB Butterworth at 81 hertz, right? I just followed this kind of shape. That's you don't really got to get a whole lot more precise than that for this sort of exercise. So really my delay time is probably something more along the lines of like, let's see, like this. It's scooted back just a little bit more.
Right. So what he's doing is he's looking at the white one, which is the target that is closely resembling what the measured response was. And he's looking at the impulse response. Mm-hmm. And the impulse response of the target was slightly behind where he had set the value for the actual measurement. So he just shifted it over to more closely mimic what the target would tell him to do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then if we look at the phase now, you see how they're like in line with each other?
Right.
And if
so the white is the target and the red is the real of the measure.
Yep. And if I were to take this back to 0, okay, that measure, that's the phase response where we started before we put in an appropriate delay time, right? But once we put an appropriate delay time in, then our phase response gets more close to, let's see, right about there, more close to the, to the target. And the reason that the phase response deviates up right here is because this magnitude response, I'm not plotting energy below about 10 hertz,
right?
10 hertz, something like that. But if I was, you would see that this does not continue on forever. It's not flat down to DC. It has a high pass effect also.
Sure.
So if I really wanted to model the phase response of this sub at very, very low frequencies, I would have to have the ability to apply a high pass filter to my model.
See, when even just doing that, it matches so much closer.
Yeah. See, when I applied the high pass filter, so it would probably be something more like, I don't even know if I can go that low. Yeah, like that 10 hertz.
That's incredible.
Now look, see how close it models it, and look how close it. So if you ever wonder, hey, what's the real phase response of my sub? How do I find the real delay time? This is how you model the response using the target gen, model the response, and then that'll tell you how far over you need to move, you need to account for the delay. So this is the real delay time of that sub, like down to a very high precision.
That's really cool. Little bit of a rabbit hole, but I think it was really good information. And it really going back to today's topic of transfer function, without the timing reference, you couldn't do any of that. So looking at phase and looking at all this other stuff, it doesn't mean anything without a timing reference, which is only available when you do a transfer function.
Yes.
That's really neat. So Nick, we talked a lot about subwoofers. Is there anything that we can learn from like high frequency drivers in the car using a transfer function?
Well, yeah, a whole lot. Let's see. I'm not quite sure what we're going to see, but we'll just take a look.
Yeah, that's the power of live, right?
Let's see here. So this is what's you got here? This is a mid-range. Oh, and it's in the stock look. It's the stock mid-range.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Yeah. I don't think it was the Harman Kardon system in this one. I'm not 100% sure, but it has a little 3.5 inch mid-range in the door, and that's this speaker. So he's got some ZR components, tweeter and 6.5s in the door. He's using the stock mid-range. Yeah.
Old favorites, huh?
Yeah. He had a box of them, brand new, just chilling. So as you can see, the high when you unmute a speaker, when you measure a speaker that has more high frequency content, the sharpness of the rise at the beginning of the impulse response is way more extreme. You can see how our subwoofer was way back here. This white trace in the background.
Yeah.
Here, that was our sub. That was our model, but still, it was basically the same thing. And you can see how it's like real long and slow. compared to the high frequency one.
So earlier when I was saying that you can see a lot in an impulse response, this is what I was talking about. Like on the same scale like this, the subwoofer, the low frequency driver has this long, slow undulation that goes, over a much wider period of time. Remember, time is passing as you go from left to right. Versus a higher frequency, we had these, skinny, spiky things. Very technical, I know, but the skinny, spiky things show that it's happening more frequently in time, higher frequencies, right? So you can see all that in an impulse response.
Yes, and also because we set our reference delay for the sub earlier, remember?
Mm-hmm.
Now this right here is how far that speaker is leading the sub. So
when you say leading it, can you explain that a little bit better?
What I mean is this time now 5.88. This was set to the time of our sub very precisely. In fact. And so now you see it says 5.88 right down here in the middle of the time zero. It's not technically the middle because I changed the scaling a little bit. But right down here it says 5.88. And so that's now our time zero. That's like our reference point in time. So now where this impulse response is positioned relative to that point, that tells us where this speaker is time relative to the sub. And because it begins to the left of that point, that means it's leading or it's ahead in time. It's coming in sooner. It's closer to the mic, basically, than the sub was. And it's closer by that much, by 2.06 milliseconds. So if I was to, type in right here that value, or in VXI shift and click, then it'll put that value in the delay. And now this speaker is in time with the subwoofer.
All right, so there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm going to do my best to try to maybe just rephrase it so that I understand it anyway. So when we first started, the zero in the middle of the time scale, right? The zero was when the actual reference signal started. And then the beginning of the impulse response was originally where we started capturing signal on the microphone. So instead of doing that, we got rid of everything that happened up until that point and moved the subwoofer, in this case, the white trace there, to be our new zero, or the beginning of where we actually care about the measurement, right? So we set that as our new zero, our new time zero. It's really the beginning of the latest arriving signal. And anything that's happening before it to the left, again, it's the first thing that happens, so it's happening first. We need to delay it and kind of shift it over to start at the same point. And that's where we add delay. And Nick showed a quick trick that if you hold the shift key down and you use the left mouse button to click at the part where it starts, that the impulse response starts, using an MVI or a VXI amplifier, it'll automatically inject that time as a delay value to move that impulse response over and line up. Is that about right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Got it then.
How much more time do we have?
A little bit. Technically, we're getting close, but I think we haven't seen anyone drop off in a while, so I think you got their attention. So keep going.
Okay. Well, there's a hidden little gem in tune here that I don't think we really talk about much, and I'll show you what it is. It's kind of neat. So, okay, so this is a transfer function of the mid-range speaker here, this red one on bottom. And if I wanted to, we'll get into this more in a future event, I think, where we talk about electrical measurements. But I do have an electrical measurement setup of this speaker. So meaning of this amplifier output that is connected to the speaker, meaning that I've probed the speaker wire with one of the high-level inputs. And so we can take a look at a measurement of that. So I'm going to move my measure signal for TF2 over to that high level input, and I'm going to leave my reference at the same reference signal that the speaker has, the microphone has. So now,
okay, so we're looking at from where the signal started to now the output of the amplifier. So we're not going to capture any of the acoustics at this point.
Yes,
we're going to capture everything up until the point where it's getting ready to go to the speaker.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Now this is the output of that amp, and then this is
beautiful
signal. Now, one of the things you can do is you can overlay these, and there's multiple ways that you can adjust the height or the y-axis position on the graph of where any trace is at. The reason that this trace is lower than the red one is because if we come and look at meters and gain, this is at a lower metered level, see that, than this. So if I was to make these two metered levels approximately equivalent, then their position on the graph will start to become more similar. See?
Right on.
Another way that you can do that is we have trace offset. You can come in here and you can add an offset into that as well. Okay. But anyway, I'll go ahead and use gain. And one of the things I just wanted to show is that, okay, so this measurement right here is the greenish colored one is the electrical signal feeding that speaker, and the red one is that speaker, right? So you can see how, like, this is a real good example. Let me scan over a little bit. I use the over arrow on my keyboard to move over. You can see how the roll off does, especially up here at the top end, the acoustic roll off does not exactly mimic the electrical, right? And this is one of the reasons why when you try to tune a DSP, if you don't have insight into these kinds of things, you set an electrical high pass, like let's say right here of 6,300 hertz. Well, if I didn't know any better, I would just assume that same filter on a tweeter that's matching up to this will result in a proper crossover. It absolutely won't, because you can see the acoustic response is not following this 6,300 hertz, the 6,300 hertz filter shape here. So having insight into this stuff is a big deal, and that's why our target gen is so powerful. And so basically, this response that we're showing right here is exactly what you would have if you modeled it with the target gen. If you made an acoustic target with the target.
That's why it looks so pretty, huh?
Yeah. One of the other things you can do though is if you ever do want to see the electrical output of VXI, you don't have to go through the steps of probing the speaker wires and all that kind of stuff. What you can actually do is if you hover over this little bar right here next to the crossovers, the cursor turns into a hand. If you click on that, it'll open up this little graph page here. If you click on the far right option of these three options here, it says overall output response, and then you choose plot in measure graph, that same response will show up plotted right here.
Wow.
And you can choose to show any or all of the outputs, and the response will show up including EQ. So including EQ. So you can plot the electrical output of the DSP on the same graph as the acoustic data without having to probe the actual speaker wires. You can probe the speaker wires like I just did. See, look, if I show my probed one,
It's the same.
it's at a slightly different level, but remember, that's because we have gains and all kinds of stuff like that involved, but I can overlay them. And so the reason that there's a slight variation up here has to do with the sample rate. It has to do with the fact that we're calculating for the modeled response for this one. We're calculating at a lower sample rate, and as frequencies get closer to Nyquist, it starts to kind of squish up the shape. But
People wonder why we don't have a manual on all this, because there's
Not a
so
big-
much stuff we couldn't document it all.
Nick just mentioned Nyquist, and that's a whole nother.
Yeah, that's another conversation. So Nick, one thing that I've always been interested in, and you and I have kind of gone round and round about this a little bit, and maybe this will be a segue towards some more of this electrical stuff in just a moment. High frequency stuff, I've never really cared much about phase. I never paid that much attention to it because in the past I thought it was just too chaotic. It's real hard to see what's going on up there. And you've corrected me. You've informed me that that's not necessarily true when it's all done correctly. And that's where transfer function allows us to see visibility even into higher frequency phase response. And although phase isn't the driving mechanism for hearing at higher frequency, it does drive the summation between like a mid-range and a high frequency driver. Is that true?
Yes. Yep. And you can see the phase response of a speaker in a car at high frequencies, especially with tune. It's very hard to do with a lot of programs because of the way that the data is computed. Basically, with tune, the way that phase. So here, I'm very used to looking at dual graph, so I always have magnitude on bottom and phase on top. So with me, I almost never look at, let me stop this one. I almost never look at phase without magnitude, without the associated magnitude. I want to know what energy is this representing, basically. It's like the way my brain works. But yeah, you can see the phase of a speaker at higher frequencies. It does get more challenging. It definitely does get more challenging. But one of the benefits about the way that Tune plots phase is this control right here called smoothing. So this smoothing control, as far as the phase data is concerned, it is not like conventional smoothing. We just don't know what else to call it. But the way that it functions is exactly identical to if you have another type of analysis software that allows you to do frequency-dependent time windowing to the impulse response, which is a whole big can of worms that we don't necessarily need to get into. But setting up that sort of stuff in other analysis software is quite complex, and you really have to, be on top of what you're doing. And it's not something you'd want to do when tuning a car in real time. It takes forever. But with Tune, all you got to do is just engage more smoothing, and basically what happens is it removes later reflected energy on a frequency dependent basis.
Wait. Hang on a second. You're telling me I can see this like more and more anechoic by changing smoothing?
Yes.
So I can ignore any reflected energy, or at least get away from it looking at my phase data.
Yeah, you can kind of see through it. Imagine if you can see through the reflected energy to the underlying speaker, right? And that has a lot of benefits. It doesn't necessarily mean if you were to remove that reflected energy from your view and then align to more anechoic phase responses and then unmute those two speakers, it doesn't mean that they're going to sum the way those two anechoic phase responses would imply, because their sum is going to be a function of the reflected energy as well.
Right.
Okay, but it is just an additional tool that's very powerful and it lets us see through the reflected energy to the timing of the transducer itself. It's basically
what the speaker's doing without the reflected energy. Of
Yeah.
course, when we're tuning the car, we have to account for the reflected energy because we are going to hear it. But for the time information, it's really helpful to see what's a reflection and what's the primary, right?
Yes. And just about all other analysis systems, measurement systems, when you apply more and more smoothing to phase data in a car like this, phase data at higher frequencies like this in a car is very, very different than if I had this speaker in a box in a room, right? Like a home speaker. It would not look like this. You would not have all of these very closely spaced, downward wrapping energies like that, right? So most analysis systems aren't really optimized for, especially those that do impulse response and phase and stuff, for in-car use. It's more about like measuring single speakers on a baffle or something if you're designing a pair of home speakers or something like that. When you apply more smoothing in most analysis systems, what happens is all of these chaotic lines like this, they just get more straight. They just get straighter, right? You don't actually remove the reflected energy. With ours, that's literally what is happening. And you can do that with some other measurement systems. You can do the same thing that we're doing here with just this simple control. You can do that, but it requires that you apply a time window to the impulse response, a frequency dependent time window.
Right, to block out anything that comes later from like a reflection.
Yeah, it's a lot more complex, and it's not just a straight time window, because then you'll lose low frequency resolution with that. It's a frequency dependent type where it lets you see more anechoically at high frequencies without sacrificing any low frequency data points.
That's cool.
So Nick, if I wanted to go tell my buddy about this, I'm not going to remember all the things you just said. Is there a way to see what smoothing does without you? Is there maybe some sort of descriptive box or something that tells us to the left?
Oh, yeah, yeah, sure. If you hover over the word, you got this little tooltip that pops up, and then if you click it, you'll get a little explanation.
On your screen at home, when you're running the software, you'll see that a lot easier than you can right now. But basically, it describes what Nick just kind of guided us through, and you can remember what all that's all about there. So.
Yeah, exactly. And we have these little tooltips in the software.
Lots of them.
Coherence, yeah. You can tell averaging. You can tell if there's a little tooltip because when you hover over the word, it kind of highlights it.
and it gets brighter, a little bit brighter.
Yeah.
Cool.
Excellent. Nick, this has been great. We got a lot of really good stuff out of today's session. I think there's some comments that maybe we can speak into. One of them.
Yes.
Go ahead,
First
Bob.
one, Sean was asking, have we noted cable length or materials having impacts to any of the max measurements?
No, for all practical realities, no, it doesn't matter pretty much, right? I mean, if you have a really long set of RCAs that are going from like the output of max to the input of your system, and they're very poorly shielded or, whatever, and you're running them next to some super noisy 120 volt, 60 hertz AC lines and stuff, then sure, you could possibly induce noise into the signal. But just purely from the length or the type of material, like whether it's copper or, I mean, if it was like some very low ground of aluminum or something, that would just be more resistive, but it wouldn't affect the time of the signal. No, for all intents and purposes, the signal is going to move down the copper wire, regardless of how long it is. We don't have that kind of time resolution.
It's about the speed of light, right? Something like that.
Roughly,
Something like that. I'm not
slow,
sure.
right?
I'm
So
not
before
sure.
we
fast.
jump off of that and go to some of the other questions, this question that Sean's brought up is a nice segue into next week's session, where we're going to talk about taking electrical measurements using transfer function. And technically, if you wanted to see the effect of the cable, you could do a transfer function from the beginning of the cable to the end of the cable to see what the cable's actually doing.
Yeah,
So-
you can measure that sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a prelude to what we're going to cover next week. It's going to be on transfer function type measurements, but using electrical measurements as well as a number of other things, and how you can use Max to do electrical measurements. But I know there's a couple other questions, Rob. You mind jumping on them?
Yeah, one more that came in from Sean.
He's
Says
busy
maybe
today.
for another training, but will auto-tune make crossover adjustments within a range, or will it suggest a manual adjustment to achieve a target response? And I think right now our automations are for EQ only. We have our auto set to EQ functionality. And then when it comes to setting your crossover filters or your high pass or low pass filter frequencies, really that's where you need to either adjust your target to fit more in line with what the driver's capable of doing. Always be careful on tweeters.
Yes.
Or adjust the filter frequency of the driver to be in line with where the target is. So that is manual. It's probably, you would say, Nick, let the data guide you to what choices need to be made.
So what I would say on that, very much what Rob was saying, if you use our auto set EQ to target feature, which is available with or without Max, by the way, but if you are using that functionality and you do not set a high pass or low pass, whatever is appropriate for your driver, and you don't do level adjustment to get it close to the target, the EQ will try to compensate for all of that. It's a waste of energy, if you ask me. I would try to shape it first. So using the example of a tweeter, put a high pass filter and try to get the shape to match the target closely, and bring the level down to get it as close to the target as possible. Then hit the auto set EQ to target. And that'll use a fewer number of filters and be more efficient in terms of your effort. Who knows, maybe one day we can improve some of this stuff and make it even easier down the road. But for today, we would recommend shaping the measured response close to your target and adjusting the level as close as possible, and then use auto set EQ. And the reason we use targets, Nick kind of touched on it in a really clear way, if you ask me today. We use targets because they're clean and sharp. And it's a lot easier to kind of see what's going on relative to a target. So when he was showing the impulse response, you could do a comparison to another impulse response, but it's also, I call it chaotic. It's a bad term, but it's not as clean and precise. So when we are using a target, we can actually do things that are very clean and precise in the setup of it all. And one thing I like about the auto set EQ to target routine is you still have control. If it doesn't do the job you want, move it, change it. We haven't locked you out. It's full visibility. Do whatever you need to get it as close to the target as you possibly can. It didn't work. Reset EQ, do it again. Change the position a little bit. Make it work for you. This is a tool that you use. Any automations that we may have are just nice. They kind of help and maybe speed it up. but you're in control every step of the way.
Scott was asking off-topic question. Crossover slopes in tune 6 dB is unmarked. It just is listed as a 6 dB filter. Is it a Butterworth 6 dB slope, Linkwitz-Riley 6 dB slope, or just a 6 dB slope?
So yeah, that's a good question. I guess we would call it a Butterworth if we were to mark it. There's a reason there's no such thing as a 6 dB Linkwitz-Riley in our little list here, and that's because a Linkwitz-Riley 12 is 2 6 dB filters cascaded together, one feeding the other. So yeah, I guess it would be a Butterworth is what you would call it. And I'm not quite sure why we didn't mark it. It could just be because there's no other option. But yeah, it probably should be marked, honestly.
I think we reached the cap on how many characters we could put in a software, so we just stopped. No, I'm kidding.
No, that's not it.
It's
And
actually
there's a way that you can there's actually a way that you can answer that question for yourself if you ever like want to investigate that kind of stuff. Is like this. I'll show you. So we'll hide this and we'll take a look at T1.
Rob, can you put a screen on?
Yep, I'm doing that now. There we go. Cool.
So let's look at a couple of target responses here. So like, let's see, 3 and 4. Let's look at 3 and 4. That one and that one. Okay. So if I were to choose a Linkwitz-Riley filter, let's say, and I set that to 300, let's do 300 hertz, right? And I look at the 300 hertz point. That's at -6. See where it says -6? You follow that line over, -6. Now, if I choose another Linkwitz-Riley filter of a steeper order, 24 dB, and I look at the 300 hertz mark again, it's still at -6. And if I choose 48 dB, 300 hertz, still at -6. So anything Linkwitz-Riley, when I look at the filter frequency, it's at -6. Now, if I choose a Butterworth, which I'll do with the opposite filter, if I choose a Butterworth, let's do a 12 dB and let's do 300 hertz. Okay. So at 300 hertz on the Butterworth, it's at -3, right? And if I do even 36 dB on the Butterworth, it's still -3. So I know I've got -6 and I've got -3. So if I choose this 6 dB one and I look at 300 hertz, what's it at? -3. So that tells me it fits into the category then of the Butterworth type, and we probably should label it.
It is grouped with it, so it's close.
I guess Steve forgot to label it.
That's it. I messed up.
Yeah.
Scott is suggesting that we call it the 6 dB SW. Scott Williams is suggesting that. Go figure out that one, huh?
Yeah. Did have a question come in from Glenn. Is there a calibration procedure before measuring an impedance response?
Impedance response. You could do that?
Yes, there is. It's very, very simple. I don't have anything plugged in right now to show impedance, but yeah, you absolutely can measure impedance, and we will talk about that in a future one of these. And Glenn, what you do is take a known resistance. So for example, choose impedance. Okay, come in here, TF1 impedance mode on. What that does when TF1 impedance mode is on, there's a relay behind these two high-level inputs here that switches them out of circuit, and it makes use of their ADC channels. So we really need to update someday to show that these two are now disconnected. But if you were to plug something in, it would go nowhere. It won't hurt anything. It just would go nowhere. So we're making use, we're like hijacking inputs 1 and 2. And notice TF1, see how it says TF1 impedance mode? Notice TF1, these lines are now over here on input, and I can drag them wherever I want. They snap back, right? It won't let me put them anywhere else until I turn that off. So when that's on, TF1 is now getting signal from ADC channels 1 and 2. So then you plug in your impedance probe, the TRS to alligator clip, and just put a known resistance on it. Something small, 10 ohms is what I recommend. Put a 10 ohm resistor on it, and you can measure the resistor with a meter. Maybe it's 9.97, whatever. And then play the noise signal through it. Play it at -20 12 or more. I usually use -9. I get the signal as high as I can for impedance, and then just play the impedance transfer function, and you'll get a straight line somewhere around this 8 to 12 point here, right? And then you know what the impedance of that resistor is because you measured it with a meter. And then what you do is just apply offset until your cursor. You'll have a cursor reading here, which I don't have right now because I don't have any real data, but you'll have a cursor reading showing the resistance, and it'll be a flat line. So it'll be the same resistance at 100 hertz as it is at 10K, because as long as it's just a, like a normal 10 ohm resistor, it's not going to have enough inductance to really change the shape of that line any. It's pretty much just going to be a flat line. So just put your cursor anywhere on that line, adjust your trace offset until it reads what the resistance actually is, which is, let's say 9.98 or something. And then once you get it, right click and hit set calibration. And that's it.
Then your probes are set. So a couple of quick things about that. One, JL Audio does offer for sale a probe kit that comes with the alligator clips and the 10 ohm resistor.
I believe Glenn has that.
And we think Glenn has that, but we'll come back to Glenn in just a moment. Nick made a reference to using your digital multimeter to check the resistor to get a precise value. Don't take our word for it. It's a 10 ohm resistor, but measure it because it'll be more accurate that way. Now, technically, if you don't calibrate it, the shape of your impedance curve is correct. The values associated with are a little bit off. So Glenn was asking if you didn't want to use the resistor, the one that we provided so generously with the kit, you just grab the alligator clips together and calibrate it that way.
What, short them together?
Correct.
No, don't do that. Put a resistance between them.
Because otherwise you don't know what that value is. So it's the same as not calibrating it if you don't have a value to offset it.
Put a resistance between them, yes.
And just to be clear, Glenn, also, not to be confused by the transfer function breakout, but it shows high level 1 and 2 on here. It's not actually connected to those channels. It's just using those channels.
It's hijacking it.
You're using the impedance probe that you have. So just make sure that you're aware these do nothing when it's connected, like Nick said.
Yeah. We need to update the UI at some point.
Yeah, at one point.
Just
we
makes
got a couple other things that we're working on. So
it makes these little XLR jacks disappear. But Glenn, there's more than one way to measure impedance with Max also, which we'll get into at some future point. There's what's called a 4-wire impedance measurement. And that's way more accurate when you get into very low, like, quarter ohm, 1/10 of an ohm kind of stuff, low impedances. It's much, much more accurate to do a 4-wire measurement where you break the voltage sense out as a separate channel. And you can do that with Max, and I can show you at some point how to do that as well. With the regular impedance probe, if you short those things together and then you calibrate it to read 0, it'll be off. You want to put a real resistance between them.
Cool. Excellent. Wow. Transfer function.
That's a lot of information.
So what I think is great about it is we did kind of cover what it was in terms of its grand scope of it, what a transfer function really is, and then we got into a number of examples of what transfer function really is all about. We started with something not related to the software, the effect of putting a subwoofer in a car. That we call that transfer function. The difference between like a prediction or an anechoic response to the in-car response. That's transfer function. Then we went ahead and did the electrical measurement of that, where we put a microphone in front of the sub, like a near field, and then we put another microphone at the listener position, and we measured the sub to the listening position, basically showing that we can actually capture that data using Max. The multiple mics, we put them where we need to. Then we transition from that into doing something more traditional in Max, where we actually are capturing the reference signal from the input of the internal reference of Max as the reference, and then the measurement from the microphone at the listener position. And we saw how we could look at low frequency response, and we saw what we can look at high frequency response. We saw the effect on magnitude, level, and time, and all three of those things can come from a transfer function engine, which is why we wanted to get into it. There's a lot that you can do with it, and it's not as simple as saying, just reference and measure. There's a lot of different things that we wanted to share with you. We got into a lot of them today, And we kind of hinted about what we want to talk about next week, which is not only electrical transfer function measurements, but taking electrical measurements in general and how we can use that to troubleshoot and do some other OEM related stuff. So next week's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to kind of build on what we did today. So if you're watching this live, cool, good for you. We'll see you next week. If you're watching this as a recording, watch the next one too. Okay. So any other questions, or is that it?
That was it. Glenn says thanks, and he has a probe kit.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for watching today. We look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.